2 children, a trail of breadcrumbs, and a witch who devours the young. We think of Hansel and Gretel as a simple fairy tale, a warning about stranger danger perhaps, or the triumph of clever children over evil. But what if I told you this story is older than the Bible, older than the pyramids, older than writing itself? Because hidden beneath this bedtime story lies a horror, one that stretches back over 7,000 years, a tale of famine, of sacrifice, and of something so terrible that we've spent millennia softening it into a children's story. Once you hear the truth behind Hansel and Gretel, you'll never look at gingerbread houses the same way again. Welcome back, Darklings. Before we unearth the ancient terror buried in this tale, let's begin with the version you think you know. But listen carefully, because every detail, every breadcrumb, every candy window, carries the echo of something far more sinister. Once upon a time, at the edge of a great forest, there lived a poor woodcutter with his wife and 2 children, Hansel and Gretel. Times were hard. Famine had gripped the land, and there was barely enough food to keep the family alive. One night, as the children lay sleeping, they overheard their parents whispering by the dying fire. "We cannot feed them," said the stepmother. "Tomorrow, we must take them deep into the forest and leave them there, or we'll all starve." The father wept, but hunger makes monsters of us all. The next morning, the family set out into the woods. But clever Hansel had heard everything. He filled his pockets with white pebbles and dropped them along the path as they walked deeper and deeper into the forest. When their parents abandoned them at nightfall, the children simply followed the moonlit trail of stones back home. But the stepmother was not so easily defeated. A few days later, she insisted they try again. This time, Hansel had no pebbles, only breadcrumbs from their meager breakfast. He scattered these along the path instead, but by the time they needed to return, the birds had eaten every last crumb. Lost and starving, the children wandered for days until they stumbled upon something impossible. A house made entirely of gingerbread and candy. The walls were cake, the windows sugar glass, the roof layered with frosting like fresh snow. They fell upon it like wild animals, tearing chunks from the walls, licking the windows, devouring everything they could reach. "Who's nibbling at my house?" came a voice crackling like autumn leaves. Out stepped an old woman, bent and gnarled, but with a smile sweet as honey. "Oh, you poor starving children," she cooed. "Come inside. I have such wonderful things to eat." And she did. Tables groaning with roasted meats, fresh bread, milk and honey, fruits that glistened like jewels. The children ate until they could barely move, and then the old woman tucked them into beds soft as clouds. But in the morning, everything changed. Hansel woke to find himself locked in a cage. The old woman's kind face had twisted into something terrible. A witch, ancient and hungry. "Eat," she commanded, shoving plates of rich food through the bars. "Fatten yourself up nicely." Each day she would feel his arm, testing if he was plump. Enough yet. But clever Hansel held out a chicken bone instead of his finger, and the witch, nearly blind with age, was fooled. Meanwhile, Gretel was forced to serve, to cook, to tend the fire that would soon consume her brother. Finally, the witch grew impatient. "Fat or thin, I'll eat him today." She ordered Gretel to light the great oven, to make it hot enough to roast a child. "I don't know how," Gretel lied. "Show me." The witch, eager for her feast, leaned into the oven to demonstrate. In that moment, Gretel pushed with all her might. The witch tumbled into the flames with a shriek that seemed to shake the very trees. The oven door slammed shut. The children filled their pockets with the witch's jewels and gold, freed themselves from that terrible house, and found their way home, where their stepmother had died, and their father welcomed them with tears of joy. They lived happily ever after. Or so the story goes. This is the version collected by the Brothers Grimm in 1812. But, like all the tales they gathered, it was already ancient when they wrote it down. The Grimms were folklorists, not authors. They were preserving stories that had been told by firelight for generations beyond counting. And Jacob Grimm believed, as many scholars do today, that the darkest fairy tales carry within them memories of something real. Something that once happened. Something so terrible that it could only survive by being transformed into fiction. In 2013, researchers from Durham University, the same team that proved Rumpelstiltskin was over 4,000 years old, turned their attention to Hansel and Gretel. Using the same evolutionary techniques, they traced the story, pattern across cultures and continents. What they found was staggering. The tale of the abandoned children, classified as ATU 327A in folklore studies, appears in virtually every culture on Earth. In Russia, it's Baba Yaga in her hut on chicken legs. In Japan, the Oni who devours children. In Mexico, La Llorona who steals the young. Always the same pattern. Children abandoned. A supernatural devourer. Escape through cunning. And the research suggests this story is over 7,000 years old. That places its origins in the Neolithic period, the dawn of agriculture, when humans first learned to plant seeds and harvest grain. It was a time of incredible change, but also of incredible horror, because with farming came something humanity had never faced before: famine on a massive scale. When crops failed, entire communities starved. And when people starve, they do things that civilization has spent millennia trying to forget. Let's talk about breadcrumbs. In the story, Hansel drops breadcrumbs to mark their path home. But breadcrumbs in a time of famine? When every grain was precious, when families were literally starving to death. This wasn't navigation. This was sacrifice. In ancient cultures, breadcrumbs scattered on the ground served a very specific purpose. They were offerings to the dead, food for spirits, payment for safe passage through the realm of the hungry ghosts. In times of extreme famine, when the boundary between life and death grew thin, people would scatter what little food they had to appease the spirits of those who had already starved. Hansel wasn't marking a path home. He was paying tribute to the dead that lined their journey. And that forest. In folklore, forests aren't just woods. They're the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. When parents led their children into the forest during famine, they weren't just abandoning them. They were consigning them to the realm of the dead. But what about the witch? What about that house of candy and cake? Here's where the story becomes truly horrifying. In times of extreme famine, there were always those who survived when others didn't. Those who had food when children were starving in the streets. Those who grew fat while their neighbors grew thin. And sometimes, the reason was unspeakable. Archaeological evidence from across Europe reveals something called famine cannibalism. Periods when human bones show cut marks, when they've been cracked open for marrow, when they've been cooked in pots meant for animals. The witch in her gingerbread house isn't just a monster from imagination. She's a folk memory of something real. Someone who had food when no one else did. Someone who lured the starving with promises of plenty. Someone who fattened children before consuming them. The house made of food. This isn't magic. This is horror. It's the ultimate symbol of plenty in a world of starvation. A trap baited with the one thing that desperate children couldn't resist. Food. And the oven. Massive, hungry, hot enough to cook a human being. This wasn't just for baking. Bread. The pattern appears again and again throughout history. During the Great Famine of 1315-1322, chronicles record people fattening children like pigs. During the Siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, Josephus wrote of mothers cooking their own infants. In the Ukrainian Holodomor, survivors spoke of houses where children went in but never came out. Hansel testing the witch by offering a bone instead of his finger. This wasn't just cleverness. This was knowledge. Knowledge of how cannibals tested their prey, how they determined when flesh was ready for harvest. Knowledge that only comes from experience, from stories passed down by those who survived when others didn't. The witch feeling. Hansel's arm each day. She wasn't checking if he was fat enough. She was checking if he was tender enough. If the meat would fall from the bone. If he was ready to eat. When Gretel, brave little Gretel, who pushes the witch into the oven, she wasn't just saving her brother. She was repeating a pattern as old as humanity itself. The moment when prey becomes predator. When the hunted becomes the hunter. When children learn that sometimes to survive, you must become the monster. The jewels and gold they take from the witch's house, these weren't treasures. They were trophies, ornaments taken from previous victims, baubles that once belonged to other children who hadn't been clever enough to escape. So what is Hansel and Gretel really about? It's about the moment when civilization breaks down, when parents abandon their children to save themselves, when hunger makes humans into monsters, when survival means becoming something inhuman. It's about a time when children disappeared into the forest and never came home. A time when some houses had food, while others had only bones. A time when the difference between predator and prey was nothing more than luck, cunning, and the willingness to do whatever it took to live another day. The story survived for 7,000 years because it carries within it a warning, a memory of what humans become when the world ends, when the crops fail, when there's nothing left to eat. But perhaps most terrifying of all, it survived because deep down, we know it could happen again. We tell ourselves it's just a fairy tale, just a story about a witch in the woods. But somewhere in our collective memory, we remember the truth. We remember the taste of desperation, the sound of children crying in the forest, the smoke rising from ovens that should only bake bread. And we remember that in the darkest times, the only difference between the witch and her victims is who gets to the oven first. But if you thought that was disturbing, wait until you hear what really happened in Hamelin. The true story behind the Pied Piper will haunt your dreams. Click here to watch it now, if you dare. See you in the next nightmare, Darklings.